Throughout the world history, human contributes many things as self-interest, and sometimes it's led to some problems and conflicts. Therefore, war represents as a symbol of social disagreements that could leave long-lasting effects on society in both economic and political terms. Particularly, the effect after the World War I that influenced and started World War II, and World War II which led to the Cold War. In this representation, we will basically look at the Cold War and the influence of Ronald Reagan during this wartime. To begin with, the history background of Ronald Reagan before he was involved in the Cold War. Ronald Reagan is the second son of John Edward Reagan, a showman, and Neil Wilson Reagan. He was born on February 6, 1911 in Tampico, Illinois. As a newborn, Reagan's father nicknamed him Dutch because he resembled a fat little Dutchman. Later, in 1920, his family moved around Illinois while his father changed self-profession, eventually settling in Dayton, Illinois. During his high school life, Reagan was an athlete, and he also starred in school plays. He graduated from Dixon High School in 1928. After that, he attended Eureka College on partial athletic scholarship where he played football. He successfully graduated from Eureka College in 1932. Soon after that, Reagan was hired as sport broadcaster for Davenport, Iowa studio station. In 1940, Reagan first married an athlete named Jane Y. Mann. They had two children, their daughter, Maureen, in 1941, and Michael, a son, in 1945. Later, they divorced in 1949. Then, in 1952, Reagan married Nancy Davis, who was an athlete. Together, they had two children, their daughter, Patricia Ann, and their son, Ronald Prescott. Reagan did a screen test for Warner Brothers movie studio in 1937. Then the studio signed him to a contract and he later became a movie star. His debut film was called Love is on the Air. Reagan appeared in more than 50 films. He was president of Screen Actors Guild from 1947 to 1952, and again in 1959 to 1960. Talking about his significant role in politics, Reagan became more interested in politics as time passed and he grew older. His view is increasingly conservative. Also, Reagan was the Republican candidate for governor of California in 1966. In 1970, he was re-elected for a second term. Later, in 1980, Reagan won the nomination and the presidency. He was the oldest person elected to President of the United States at the age of 69. Reagan served as the 40th president from 1981 to 1989. Additionally, Reagan, often known as the Great Communicator for his charms and ability to engage audience, was remarkably quotable. His few lasting phrases was, "The 9 most terrifying words in English language are, I'm from government and I'm here to help," at the news conference August 12, 1986.
During the Reagan presidency, there was an event that expanded conflict to most parts of the world after World War II, the Cold War. To look at the reason why the Cold War has started, there are 4 factors that caused this war to happen, including tension of superpower, nuclear arms race, ideological conflict, and spread of communism. Firstly, the tension of superpower. The tension was raised after the end of World War II. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, was an ally with Britain, France, and the United States. They were against the Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. The important event that connected the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War is the Yalta Conference and Potsdam Conference. To start with the Yalta Conference, it was the meeting of three leaders of Allied nations, including Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. They were there to discuss about how to organize Europe after they can defeat Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. They would divide Germany into 4 zones to manage the internal affairs of each zone. Berlin, the capital of Germany, belonged to the Soviet Union, which seemed to be unfair to the rest Allied countries, the US, France, and Britain. So, Berlin with the Soviet control would be divided into 4 parts as well. This is going to affect the Cold War in the near future. They decided that the country under control of Nazi will be independent and there will be elections to have their own government. All these countries were required to be under the democratic system, and this is one of the major reasons that can cause the Cold War, because it created conflict within the 3 superpowers as they did not trust each other. Stalin was indignant that he believed that he was slowing the Normandy invasion and invasion of Italy. Next, the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. This meeting would include Harry S. Truman, who was the next president after Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. The conference was continued from the Yalta Conference of how they would handle after the Nazi Germany lose and how the war would keep on after the war. This conference is going to be another cause that increased conflict between the 3 Allied superpowers, especially the divide of the United States and the Soviet Union. In the conference, Truman also aware Stalin of American automatic weapon program called Manhattan Project, and the Americans would be the first to develop atomic bomb. Eventually, the United States would drop atomic bomb at Hiroshima in Japan in August 1945 after the conference ended. Consequently, the Soviet Union felt threatened by the United States. It could be said that the Cold War began because of the distrust and tension of the Allied superpower of the United States and the Soviet Union. The next factor is nuclear arms race. The United States had developed their atomic weapon called Manhattan Project. In the beginning of the Cold War, the only nation that had atomic weapons was the United States, as they were used to bomb Japan in 1945. Then, on August 29 in 1949, the first Soviet Union atomic bomb called First Lightning had been tested. With the development of nuclear weapons, it raised the mistrust between the 2 nations. This led to the large arsenal of nuclear weapons of both sides that had been developed in the early decades of the Cold War. And they would have nuclear weapons which would be enough to destroy each other by the 1950s. The movement of nuclear weapons acted as means of defense. The nuclear arms race of Soviet Union and the United States raised the tension of the war and fear of nuclear war. Another factor is ideological conflict. There was an ideological conflict between the Soviet Union, who was a communist and dictatorship, and the United States, who believed in capitalism and democracy. In terms of economic, the Soviet would be the far left side, whereas the United States would be the far right side. The Soviet Union wanted to make Germany become as big as possible, so that they could not stand up against them like it used to during World War II. But the United States disagreed with them, and they would rather help Germany to become a democratic country. The conflict between the 2 nations mostly came from different ideology and had a different worldview, as the Soviet Union tried to expand communism and the United States tried to prevent it with policy. Lastly, spread of communism. In the outset of Cold War, Harry S. Truman, a leader of the United States, was afraid that communism would spread to Europe and the rest of the world. The United States would help countries that were influenced by the communism of the Soviet Union to rebel and create their own democracy. This plan was known as Marshall Plan. With this perspective of Truman, he had created the basis of American foreign policy throughout the time of the Cold War, which was known as the Truman Doctrine. The idea was that the United States should retain the Soviet power and the spread of communism. And because of this attempt by the United States, it would drag them into conflict with the Soviet Union, because it tried to stop the expansion of Soviet Union. Now, we are going to talk about the significant event in the Cold War. Basically, the Cold War was different from other wars. They would not fight against each other directly, but they would improve the shield to protect themselves from the enemy, as the nations were competing to develop their intellectual invention and advanced weapons. So, let's get into what happened in the war. To begin with, the Berlin blockade in 1948. Because of the initial disagreement and tension between the Soviet Union and the other Allied nations, including the United States, France, and England, the three main Allied nations decided to unite their own part of controlled territory in Germany into one at the western side. On the other hand, the Soviet Union, who controlled all the eastern side, decided to establish a blockade between the western and eastern side of Germany to separate these two territories and block other Allied nations from entering the eastern part and capital city like Berlin. Furthermore, to make sure that the western part and the eastern part were entirely separate, all rail lines, canals, and roads from west into East Berlin to the Russian sector were blocked. This cut off supply of food and fuel. Also, there was an organization called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, that was introduced by the US and its allies to protect themselves in case the Soviet Union would try to attack them. Moreover, it played an important role in preventing the spread of communism. Later, the Soviet Union was going to respond by forming their own organization called the Warsaw Pact. By 1961, the Berlin Wall was established. The Soviet Union decided to replace the Berlin blockade with a strong concrete. This division seemed to be more practical and being recognized as an official division within Germany and also the former alliance like the Soviet Union and the US. The length of the Berlin Wall could be estimated to be 153 kilometers. The Cold War would not only happen in Europe, but the conflict also spread to Asia and created battle as well. For example, in the case of Korean War in 1950 to 1953, it has been recognized as proxy war between the Soviet Union, who promoted the communist idea, and the United States, who are the leader of democratic liberalism. Because of the intervention of both powerful nations in different Korean territories, it divided people's ideology and perspective. The North believed in the communism and being supported by the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the South was supported by the US and believed in the power of democracy. This conflict led to an official separation of Korea into North and South, and it is still permanent until today. As well as what happened in the Vietnam War during 1959 to 1975. Is what the conflict between North Vietnam, supported by the main powerful communist nations such as the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, who supported by democratic nations including the United States, South Korea, Philippines, and Australia. As we mentioned earlier, the Cold War is like a competition field between warring countries. Instead of declaring war and conducting direct fighting, they compete for a progressive civilization for many aspects, including economy, technological, advancement, social, and military. Therefore, when the Sputnik, the Earth's first artificial satellite, was first launched in 1957 as a name of the Soviet Union, it could bring all the planes and also increase the sense of competition and tension during the Cold War time. To extend an important change that occurred by the time of the Cold War, Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, died. After the Korean War, and Nikita Khrushchev replaced him. Unlike Stalin, he preferred to minimize communism in the country. Later on, the SALT Treaty would be one of the influences that helped to compromise the tension of the Cold War. Then, Mikhail Gorbachev was going to be the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. He started to establish an agreement with the US called the Glasnost, which called for the Soviet Union to prevent corruption within the Soviet government, as well as Perestroika in 1987, which emphasized political reconstruction. This was an important factor to relieve the conflict on the global stage.
And this is the first question for this presentation. Why did the United States and the Soviet Union not decide to fight directly against each other?
Next, we are going to focus on what Reagan did during the Cold War. Ronald Reagan was the president of the US in 1980, and he would be one of the important parts to stop the conflict of superpowers. One of his well-known strategies was called Reagan Doctrine, or the US foreign policy, which were conducted during 1980 to 1991. His foreign policy was considered as the foundation that supported freedom fighters throughout the world. He presented his foreign political will with a dramatic statement. Freedom is not the sole prerogative of chosen field. It is the universal right of God's children. As the United States is a country that mainly concerned about freedom and democracy, so it can be said that it is the mission for America to defend and continue freedom and democracy. Therefore, Reagan had a policy to provide military help to the freedom fighters. In other words, he conversely supported the attack on the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Meanwhile, the Afghan rebels were fighting against the Soviet occupiers among the midst. President Reagan continued to defend his action, which supported freedom and democracy during his 2 terms in office. The main goal of the foreign policy of the United States during the Reagan's presidency was winning the Cold War and forcing to change communist policy. Eventually, this goal of the foreign policy was achieved in 1989 during the revolution that would bring the end of the Cold War. Apart from the foreign policy, Reagan had given a famous speech at the Berlin Wall, aiming to seek for peace. It is also known as the Berlin Wall speech. As he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," in West Berlin on June 12, 1987. Reagan called for Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, to open the Berlin Wall, which has separated West and East Berlin since 1961. This is the end of long-lasting conflict, the Cold War.
At the end of Ronald Reagan's life, he retired from the White House to residence in Bel Air, a rich Los Angeles suburb. He spent the following 6 years preparing his memoir and managing the construction of Ronald Reagan's presidential library in Summit Valley, California. Reagan revealed in a handwriting letter to American people in November 1994 that he has recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Later, on June 5, 2004, Reagan died at his Los Angeles home at the age of 93, making him the country's longest-serving president. And now, I'm going to leave you guys with the last question for today. And the last question is, what was the purpose of Yalta Conference and the formation of NATO?